The planet Draken was a world of dust and stone. The sun above was pale and weak, and the ground was filled with deep cracks that seemed to stretch forever. In those cracks, tunnels had been carved, and inside those tunnels, hundreds of slaves worked day and night. Their task was to dig for shining crystals that the overseers wanted. These crystals powered ships, weapons, and machines. To the overseers, the crystals were wealth and power. To the slaves, the crystals were chains. Among those slaves was a young alien girl named Lyra. Her skin was pale gray, and her eyes were a dim shade of green. Her arms were thin from years of hard labor, and her back ached every time she lifted the heavy tools. Lyra had been in the mines for as long as she could remember. She could not recall the face of her parents. She only remembered the mines, the overseers' harsh voices, and the endless sound of hammers striking stone. Every morning, the overseers shouted and ordered the slaves to work. The air was thick with dust, and it hurt to breathe. Lyra often coughed, her chest burning, but she dared not stop. If she slowed down, she would be struck by the whips of the guards. She had seen others punished that way, and she knew the pain was unbearable. So she kept moving, even when her body wanted to fall to the ground. The mines were dark, lit only by dim lamps placed on the walls. The lamps flickered, casting long shadows that made the tunnels seem alive. The sound of picks and shovels echoed endlessly. The slaves worked in silence most of the time, too afraid to speak. Words could draw attention, and attention could mean punishment. Lyra's hands were rough and cut from sharp rocks. She had scars on her arms, marks from years of scraping and lifting. Still, she carried on. Deep inside, she wished for something better, but her hope was faint. Most slaves believed there was no escape from Draken. The overseers controlled everything. The guards had weapons, and the tunnels were sealed with heavy gates. Outside, the land was empty and cruel. No one could survive without the overseers' supplies. At night, when work ended, the slaves were locked in small barracks built from stone. The rooms were crowded, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and dust. Lyra would lie on the hard floor, staring at the ceiling, listening to the tired breaths of the others. In those moments, her mind drifted. She dreamed of wide skies, of rivers, of places where no chains existed. But every time she closed her eyes, she remembered the overseers' voices, and the dream faded. One evening, after a long day, Lyra sat near the wall of the barrack. She rubbed her hands, trying to ease the pain in her fingers. An older slave, a man named Turin, sat beside her. His face was lined with age, and his eyes were dull. He whispered to her in a low voice, careful that no guard could hear. "Do not lose yourself," Turin said. "If you give up hope, you give them everything." Lyra looked at him. "Hope does not open the gates," she said softly. Turin sighed. "Perhaps not. But without hope, the gates will never open at all." Lyra wanted to believe his words, but her heart was heavy. She had seen so many slaves grow weak and fall. Some never rose again. The overseers did not care. They only brought more to replace them. The next morning, the overseers forced the slaves deeper into the mines. They wanted more crystals, and the tunnels had to be widened. Lyra carried her pickaxe and walked with the others into the dark. The air grew hotter as they descended. The rocks glowed faintly, a reminder of the crystals buried within. As she struck the wall with her tool, a piece of stone broke away, revealing a small crystal. It shimmered faintly in the light. For a moment, Lyra forgot her pain and stared at it. The crystal was beautiful, like a star trapped inside the rock. She reached out to touch it, but a guard shouted, and she quickly stepped back. The guard took the crystal and placed it into a container. Lyra lowered her head and returned to work. Hours passed. The sound of metal on stone filled the air. Sweat dripped from Lyra's forehead, and her arms shook with fatigue. Yet she did not stop. None of them could. As the day ended, the slaves were marched back to the surface. The sky above Draken was red with dust, the sun sinking behind the hills. Lyra looked at the horizon. For a brief moment, she wondered if beyond those hills, there was freedom. She had never seen what lay outside the mines. She did not know if there were oceans or forests on this planet. All she knew were rocks, tunnels, and chains. That night, as she lay on the floor again, she felt the weight of her life pressing down on her. She wanted to cry, but no tears came. Her body was too tired. She closed her eyes and let the darkness of sleep take her. In her dreams, she saw a figure standing in the light. She could not see the face, but she felt warmth. It was not like the overseers, whose presence always brought fear. This figure felt different, safe, and strong. She reached out in her dream, but the light faded, and she was back in the tunnels again. Lyra woke the next day with the same ache in her heart. She thought the dream meant nothing. Yet, deep inside, a small flame had been lit. She did not know it then, but her life was about to change. Far above Draken, beyond the dusty sky, ships were moving through space. One of those ships carried humans, and soon, they would land on the world of chains. The next day in the mines of Draken was the same as every day. The slaves marched into the tunnels, their steps heavy, their faces pale with exhaustion. The overseers shouted, their voices echoing against the stone walls. Lyra walked with the others, holding her pickaxe close. Her arms still ached from the previous day, but she knew no mercy would come from the guards. Work was the only choice. Far above the tunnels, in the silent sky of Draken, a ship entered orbit. It was not like the overseers' ships, which were sharp and cold, built only for command. This ship was wide and strong, marked with blue lights. Inside it were humans, explorers from distant space. They were searching for new resources, unaware of the suffering buried on Draken's surface. The leader of the team was a man named Mason. His hair was dark, his eyes steady, and his voice calm but firm. He had traveled across many worlds, always curious, always searching for signs of life and new knowledge. Beside him were three others: Rena, who studied alien cultures, Joran, who was skilled with machines, and Kale, who served as their pilot. Together they had crossed stars, but none of them expected what they would soon find. Their ship landed on the dusty ground, far from the overseer's fortress. The engines stirred up clouds of red dust as the ramp lowered. Mason stepped out first, his boots pressing against the dry soil. He looked around, taking in the strange horizon. The air was thin, but breathable. Hills rose in the distance, broken by cracks in the earth. "This world looks dead," Joran muttered, scanning the land. No rivers, no forests, only rock. Rena adjusted her scanner. "Not dead," she said. "There are life signs. Small movements underground." Mason turned his gaze toward the hills. "Underground. That means tunnels. Let's see what is hidden here." The humans moved carefully, following the signals from their scanners. Hours passed as they walked, until at last they came upon the entrance of the mines. The gates were heavy, made of black metal, guarded by overseers. The overseers were tall, armored beings with pale skin and sharp features. They carried energy weapons at their sides. From behind the gates, faint sounds reached the humans' metal striking stone, low groans of effort, chains clinking. Mason's eyes narrowed. He knew those sounds. They were the sounds of forced labor. "Slaves," he whispered. His heart grew heavy. He had seen cruelty before on other worlds, but each time, the sight filled him with the same anger. The overseers noticed the humans. They raised their weapons, but Mason lifted his hand in peace. "We come as explorers," he said in a steady voice. "We wish to trade and learn." The overseers eyed them with suspicion. They did not welcome strangers easily. Still, one of them stepped forward. "This is our land," the guard said coldly. "The mines are ours. Leave now." Mason kept his calm. "What are you mining?" he asked. "Crystals," the guard replied. "They are not for you. Now go." Rena leaned closer to Mason, her voice low. "Did you hear the sounds? There are people inside. Not guards. Workers." Mason nodded slightly. He had no proof yet, but his instincts told him the truth. Those sounds were not machines. They were lives being crushed under the weight of chains. That night, the humans set up camp not far from the mine. They lit small lamps and shared quiet words. Mason could not rest. He sat apart from the others, looking at the distant glow of the overseer's fortress. His mind was troubled. "Something is wrong here," he said when Rena joined him. "I heard the pain in those voices. These people are not workers. They are slaves." Rena placed her hand on his arm. "If that is true, then what do we do? We cannot fight the overseers. We are only four." Mason looked at the stars. "Maybe we cannot fight them head on. But we can help. Even small steps matter." The next day, while the overseers guarded the main gates, Mason and his team circled around the mines. They searched for hidden paths. Soon, they found a narrow tunnel where waste rock was thrown out. Through the cracks, Mason saw figures inside. His breath caught in his throat. They were thin, tired beings, their clothes torn, their faces hollow. They carried heavy stones and dragged chains across the ground. Among them was Lyra. Her eyes were dim with exhaustion, but when the light from Mason's lamp touched her face, she looked up. For a moment, her gaze met his. Mason froze. He saw pain in her eyes, but also something else, a faint spark of life that had not yet been crushed. He reached through the gap, holding out a flask of water. Lyra stared at it, unsure if it was real. No overseer ever gave water freely. Slowly, she reached out her hand and took it. She drank carefully, her throat burning as the cool liquid slid down. Tears formed in her eyes, though she did not fully understand why. Mason spoke softly. "You are not alone. We will help you." Lyra did not know the words, but she felt the tone. It was gentle, not harsh. She looked at Mason's face. His eyes held no cruelty. Instead, they held concern, something she had never seen from a master. For the rest of that day, Mason and his team returned to the tunnel whenever they could. They passed bits of food, small cloths, and water to the slaves inside. Lyra was one of the first to accept, though she still trembled with fear. She could not believe strangers from the sky would risk angering the overseers just to help. When the overseers walked past, Mason and his team hid in the shadows. They knew discovery would mean danger. Yet Mason did not stop. Each time he saw the tired faces, his resolve grew stronger. By nightfall, Lyra lay in the barracks, holding the small cloth Mason had given her. It was soft, unlike the rough rags she wore. She pressed it to her cheek, closing her eyes. For the first time in many years, she felt something she had nearly forgotten. She felt hope. She whispered a thought to herself, though no one could hear. Maybe the dream was not only a dream. Far outside, Mason sat awake again, his hand resting on his pack. He knew what he had seen. He knew what had to be done. He could not turn away. These people needed help, and he would give it, no matter the risk. The overseers ruled with fear, but Mason carried something stronger. He carried the will to stand against cruelty. And though he did not know her name yet, he had already chosen. He would not let the girl with green eyes remain a slave. The days in the mines of Draken rarely changed. Work began at dawn and ended only when darkness filled the sky. Slaves bent their backs, cut stone, and carried heavy loads until their bodies trembled. For Lyra, every day felt like the last. Yet something new had entered her life. The humans. She did not know who they were or why they came, but she remembered the man with dark hair and steady eyes. He had given her water. He had spoken with a voice that carried no threat. It was the smallest act, but to Lyra, it felt like the sky itself had opened. She could not stop thinking about him. Mason, too, could not forget the face of the young alien girl. Her eyes had told him more than any words. They carried pain, but also a spark that refused to die. That spark stirred something inside him, a force that demanded action. He had seen cruelty before, but here, it felt heavier, sharper. He knew he could not simply leave. The next morning, Mason and his team returned to the hidden tunnel. They carried food wrapped in cloth and flasks filled with water. Mason watched the slaves work from behind the cracks, his heart tightening at the sight of their suffering. When he saw Lyra again, he reached through and placed a piece of bread on the ground. She hesitated, looking around in fear of the guards. Then, slowly, she picked it up. The bread was rough but soft compared to the stale crumbs the overseers provided. She tasted it carefully, her body shaking as she chewed. It was warm, and for a moment she forgot she was in chains. Her eyes lifted to Mason's face again. He gave her a small nod, as if to say, "You are safe." She clutched the bread tightly, unwilling to let go. Other slaves noticed too. They looked with surprise and hunger. Mason and his companions shared what they could, passing water and food through the gap. It was not much, but it was more than the slaves had known in years. One of the older slaves, Turin, moved closer to Lyra. His voice was low, filled with wonder. "Who are these beings?" he asked. Lyra shook her head. "I do not know. They are not like the masters." That night, when the slaves were taken back to the barracks, whispers spread. Some spoke of the strangers who offered food. Others dismissed it, saying it must be a trick. Yet in every heart, a seed had been planted. Something they thought lost forever, hope, was beginning to grow. Inside their camp, Mason sat with his team. Rena was concerned. "If the overseers discover us helping the slaves, they will come after us. We could lose the ship. We could lose everything." Mason's eyes were firm. "And if we do nothing, they will lose their lives. We cannot walk away." Joran leaned back, frowning. "You are talking about defying a whole system. The overseers have weapons, soldiers, fortresses. We have one ship and 4 people. Mason answered calmly. Sometimes 4 people are enough. Sometimes 1 person is enough. If we can free even 1, if we can give them strength, then we have already changed something. Rena studied him for a long moment. She knew Mason well. Once he set his heart on something, nothing could move him. She sighed and nodded. Then we must be careful. We must move like shadows. The following days, Mason and his team continued their secret visits. Each time, Lyra saw them, and each time she felt something new stir inside her. The fear was still there, but alongside it was a warmth she did not recognize. She found herself waiting for their visits, her heart beating faster when Mason's face appeared through the cracks. One afternoon, as the slaves worked in silence, Mason whispered to Lyra through the tunnel. "What is your name?" Lyra did not understand the words, but his tone was gentle. She pointed to herself and whispered, "Lyra." Mason smiled and repeated softly, "Lyra." The sound of her name on his lips startled her. No overseer had ever spoken her name with kindness. To them, she was only a number, a tool. Hearing her name spoken as if it mattered brought a sharp ache to her chest. She pointed to him. He understood. "Mason," he said. She repeated it quietly. "Mason." The exchange was simple, yet powerful. For the first time, Lyra felt like someone saw her not as a slave, but as a person. She carried that feeling with her as she worked, and it gave her strength she did not know she had. That night, as she lay on the hard stone floor of the barracks, she whispered the name to herself. Mason. The word felt strange on her tongue, but it made her feel less alone. Meanwhile, Mason could not sleep either. He thought of Lyra's face, the way her eyes had widened when he spoke her name. He thought of all the others still trapped. His resolve hardened. He would not leave Draken without trying to free them. But danger was growing. The overseers had begun to notice small changes. Some slaves were less weak, moving with faint energy. Food had been shared among them that did not come from the overseers' stores. Suspicion spread. Guards whispered to each other, and eyes turned sharper. One evening, as Mason passed water through the gap, Lyra's hand brushed his for a second. She froze, expecting punishment, but none came. Instead, Mason gave her a reassuring look. That small touch lingered in her mind long after she returned to the barracks. For Lyra, this was something she had never known. A hand that did not strike. A voice that did not command. A presence that did not demand. She could not explain it, but she knew her life was no longer the same. The slaves of Draken had lived in chains for countless years. To them, kindness was a forgotten word. But now, through the actions of a few humans, that word had returned. It was fragile, like a candle in the dark. Yet even the smallest candle could push back the night. Lyra closed her eyes and thought of the man named Mason. She remembered the water, the bread, the sound of her name. For the first time in her memory, she felt a quiet belief forming inside her. Perhaps the gates of Draken were not unbreakable after all. The air inside the mines of Draken grew heavier each day. The overseers had begun watching the slaves more closely. Guards stood longer hours at the gates, and their eyes followed every movement. Something had stirred inside the tunnels, and the overseers felt it. They did not know yet what it was, but suspicion hung thick in the air. Lyra felt the change too. She could see the guards' sharper stares, hear the way their voices cut deeper when they shouted. She worked with trembling hands, her heart racing whenever she thought about Mason and the others. The humans still came at night, slipping food and water through the cracks, whispering words of comfort. But each time, Lyra feared it might be the last. Mason knew they could not keep their secret much longer. The overseers would discover the truth, and when they did, the slaves would suffer worse than before. One evening, as the humans sat in their camp, Mason spoke firmly. "We cannot wait," he said. "The overseers are closing in. If we stay in the shadows, they will find us. We must act now." Rena's eyes widened. "You mean a rescue?" "Mason, we do not have the numbers. They have soldiers, gates, weapons." Joran shook his head. "She is right. We are only 4. Mason leaned forward. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with determination. 4 is enough. We do not need to fight an army. We only need to open a way. If we can free some, they will follow. And if even a handful escape, it will be worth it." Kale, the pilot, crossed his arms. "And if we are caught, we may not leave this world at all." Mason looked at them one by one. "We came here searching for resources, but we found people in chains. We cannot turn our backs now. If we leave, their chains will grow heavier, because they will know no one came for them. I will not let that happen." Silence hung over the camp. Then Rena nodded slowly. "If you go, we go with you. None of us will stand aside." That night, they prepared in secret. Mason studied the maps of the mines, drawn from the scanners on their ship. He found the weakest points in the gates and planned the path. They would strike in the darkest hours, when the overseers grew tired and fewer guards stood watch. Inside the barracks, Lyra lay awake, staring at the stone ceiling. She clutched the small cloth Mason had given her, holding it close to her chest. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she felt something building in the air. A storm was coming, not of dust or stone, but of change. When the night grew silent, Mason and his team moved. They wore dark cloaks to hide their shapes and carried simple tools to cut through locks. The stars above Draken shone faintly, giving little light, but enough to guide their steps. At the gate of the slave barracks, Mason worked quickly. His hands moved with skill, and the lock gave way with a soft click. He pushed the door open, and inside, rows of tired slaves stirred in confusion. Lyra sat up, her eyes wide when she saw him. She recognized his face at once. Mason stepped forward and whispered, "Come with us." The slaves hesitated. Fear held them still. To leave meant danger, punishment, even death. But Torin, the old slave, stood slowly. His voice shook, but his words were clear. "If we stay, we die in chains. If we go, we may die free. I will follow." Others began to rise, their eyes flickering with uncertain hope. Lyra's heart pounded. She looked at Mason, then at the door. For a long moment, she could not move. Then she stepped forward, her chains clinking softly. She chose to follow. Mason led them through the shadows, guiding them toward the hidden tunnel. The humans moved swiftly, keeping the group quiet. But the night was not silent for long. A guard turned the corner, his eyes catching the movement. He shouted, raising his weapon. In an instant, chaos broke out. The slaves froze, fear surging through them, but Mason leaped forward. He struck the guard with a swift blow, knocking him down before the weapon could fire. The sound echoed through the tunnels, and alarms began to ring. "Run," Mason commanded. "Run now." The slaves obeyed, their fear turning to desperate speed. Lyra ran with them, her chains dragging behind her. The tunnels shook with noise as overseers shouted and guards poured in. Beams of light cut through the darkness as weapons fired, striking stone walls. Rena and Joran fought at the rear, blocking the guards with quick strikes and flashes of energy from their tools. Kale guided the group toward the surface, his voice sharp and steady. Mason stayed close to Lyra, shielding her whenever danger drew near. At last, they reached the surface. The night air was cold, filled with dust. In the distance, the humans' ship waited, its lights glowing like a beacon. The overseers' forces were closing in fast. Dozens of guards marched, their weapons raised. Mason knew they could not outrun them all. He turned to Rena. "Take them to the ship. I will hold them off." "No," Rena said fiercely. "We hold together." Lyra looked at Mason, her chest tight. She could not understand all his words, but she understood his meaning. He was ready to give everything for them. For her. The group pressed forward, racing across the ground. Blasts of energy lit the night as guards fired. Some slaves stumbled, but others helped them rise, refusing to leave anyone behind. For the first time, they fought for each other, not just for survival, but for freedom. As the ship's ramp lowered, the humans and slaves rushed inside. Mason was the last to enter, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the field. He saw the overseers in the distance, their fortress glowing with alarms. This was only the beginning. Inside the ship, the freed slaves collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Lyra sat among them, her heart racing. She looked at Mason, who stood at the entrance, his figure outlined by the ship's lights. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her chains lift, even if only for a moment. Mason turned, meeting her gaze. He gave a small nod, as if to promise that this was not the end. Lyra held his eyes, and in her chest, something new burned bright. Not fear, not sorrow, but hope. The engines roared, and the ship lifted into the sky. Behind them, Draken's mines glowed with fury, overseers shouting into the night. Ahead of them, the stars stretched wide, a path of unknown promise. The ship carried its passengers away from the mines of Draken. For many of the freed slaves, it was their first time leaving the tunnels and stepping into a vessel that could cross the stars. They sat on the floor, their chains still clinging to their wrists and ankles. Some stared in silence, some trembled, and some whispered in disbelief. Lyra sat near the wall, her eyes wide as she looked around. The walls of the ship glowed with soft light, unlike the dark stone she had always known. The hum of the engines filled the air, steady and calm, not harsh like the overseer's machines. Everything felt strange, but also safe. She touched the smooth surface beside her, amazed by its warmth. Mason moved through the cabin, handing out water and food to the freed slaves. He spoke gently, even though most of them did not understand his words. His tone was enough. It carried kindness, something they had never heard from the overseers. When Mason reached Lyra, she looked up at him. Their eyes met, and he gave her a soft smile. He handed her a small packet of food, then crouched down so he would not tower over her. She hesitated, then accepted it. The food was soft and sweet, unlike anything she had tasted before. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. Rena moved among the slaves too, checking their wounds. She carried a small medical kit and worked carefully. Many had cuts, bruises, and broken skin from years in the mines. She cleaned their wounds, wrapped them in bandages, and gave them medicine to ease their pain. Some wept as she touched them, not from pain, but from the shock of gentle hands. When Rena reached Lyra, the girl flinched at first. She was not used to anyone approaching without anger. But Mason nodded, reassuring her. Slowly, Lyra allowed Rena to treat her cuts. The bandages were soft, and the medicine cooled her burning skin. Lyra looked at Rena with wide eyes, whispering a faint word in her own tongue. Rena did not understand, but she smiled, knowing it was a thank you. As hours passed, the freed slaves grew calmer. Some leaned against the walls and fell asleep, their bodies too weak to remain awake. Others sat in silence, watching the humans with cautious eyes. Lyra remained awake, unable to close her eyes. Her thoughts swirled like a storm. She had never imagined leaving the mines. She had never believed such a moment could exist. Yet here she was, surrounded by stars. Mason noticed her restless gaze and sat beside her. He spoke softly, pointing to himself. Mason. Then he pointed to her. Lyra. She understood and nodded. Her lips formed his name again. Mason. His smile grew warmer. He pointed toward the stars visible through a small window. Freedom, he said. Lyra tilted her head, not knowing the word, but she felt the meaning in his tone. For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Then Mason reached into his pack and pulled out a small device. It was a translator, a tool for bridging languages. He placed it gently between them, showing her how to speak into it. Lyra, he said into the device. A soft voice repeated her name in her own language. Her eyes widened. She touched the device, curiosity sparking in her heart. Slowly, she whispered a word of her own language into it. The device spoke in Mason's tongue. Mason's face lit with surprise, then joy. Now we can understand each other, he said. Lyra gasped softly as the device repeated his words in her language. For the first time, she understood. Tears filled her eyes. She pressed her hand to her chest. I understand, she whispered. Mason nodded. Yes. We can speak now. The bridge of language changed everything. Lyra's words came slowly, broken from years of silence, but Mason listened with patience. She told him of the mines, of the overseers, of the endless work. She spoke of how she had been taken as a child and had never known freedom. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out, as if letting go of a weight she had carried for too long. Mason listened carefully, his hands tightening into fists as she spoke. Anger burned inside him, but he did not show it. Instead, he offered calm words. You are safe now. No one will hurt you here. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt and hope. Safe, she repeated softly, as if testing the word. Yes, Mason said firmly. Safe. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe it. In the days that followed, the humans worked to heal the freed slaves. Joran built simple beds and made sure the ship ran smoothly. Kale watched the skies for overseer patrols, always ready to move if danger approached. Rena cared for the weak, her hands gentle and her voice soothing. And Mason stayed close to the slaves, speaking to them, encouraging them, reminding them they were more than their chains. Lyra began to change. At first, she sat in silence, afraid to speak. But slowly, she used the translator more. She asked questions about the stars, about the ship, about the humans themselves. She learned that humans came from a blue world filled with oceans and forests, a place unlike the dust of Drucken. The thought amazed her. She also began to smile. It was faint, small, but real. Each time Mason saw it, his heart grew stronger. He knew the scars of her past would never vanish, but he also knew she was beginning to heal. One evening, Lyra sat near the window, staring at the endless stars. Mason joined her. She turned to him and asked softly, "Why did you help us? Why risk your lives for strangers?" Mason thought for a moment, then answered with steady words. "Because no one deserves chains. Because freedom is not just for some, it is for all." Lyra listened, her chest tightening. She had never heard words like those. To the overseers, she was nothing but a tool. To Mason, she was a person. She whispered, "I do not know how to be free." Mason gave her a gentle smile. "You will learn. Freedom is not given, it is lived. Step by step, you will find it." Lyra lowered her gaze, her hands trembling. But inside, she felt a warmth that grew brighter each day. Mason's words did not erase her pain, but they gave her something stronger than fear. They gave her hope for tomorrow. The scars on her body would remain, but the scars on her heart were beginning to heal. And for Lyra, that was the first true miracle of her life. The ship glided through the stars like a quiet bird crossing the night sky. Days passed since they had escaped the mines of Drucken. For many of the freed slaves, life aboard the human vessel was the first taste of peace. They still carried fear in their hearts, but every sunrise they saw through the ship's glass windows reminded them that their chains were gone. Lyra had begun to change. At first, she barely spoke, her words broken by years of silence and fear. But now, with the help of the translator, she asked questions about the ship, the stars, and the humans themselves. Her voice was still soft, but each word carried new strength. Mason noticed her growth every day. She no longer sat alone in the corner. Instead, she sat near the window, watching the endless stars with wonder. She even tried to teach Mason some words from her own language. He struggled with the sounds, but his effort made her laugh, and the sound of her laughter filled the ship with warmth. Yet peace was fragile. The overseers were still searching. Kale, the pilot, kept the ship moving from sector to sector, avoiding patrols. Joran repaired damaged parts of the vessel to keep it in working order. Rena continued caring for the weak, and Mason spent much of his time guiding the freed slaves, reminding them that they were no longer tools, but living beings who deserved life and dignity. One evening, while Mason checked supplies, Kale entered the cabin with a grim face. "We have a problem," he said. Mason looked up. "What is it?" Kale pointed at the star map. "The overseers are tightening patrols. They know slaves escaped. If we keep moving aimlessly, they will find us." Rena frowned. "Then where do we go? We cannot keep running forever." Kale hesitated. "There is one place. A hidden colony on the edge of the sector. It is not controlled by the overseers. But it is risky to reach. The route is watched." Mason's jaw tightened. "Then that is where we go. These people need a home. We cannot just wander." Joran nodded in agreement. "The ship can handle the journey. But we must be careful." The decision was made. They would aim for the colony. When Mason explained this plan to the freed slaves through the translator, many looked nervous. They feared being caught again. Lyra's eyes filled with worry, but she lifted her chin and asked, "This colony, safe?" Mason met her gaze. "Safer than anywhere else." It will give you a chance to build a new life. Her lips trembled. She whispered, "Then we go." The journey began. The ship moved cautiously, avoiding patrol routes, drifting through asteroid belts and nebula clouds to remain unseen. Every moment was tense, but the humans remained focused. During the quiet hours of travel, Mason spent time with Lyra. One night, she sat near the window, her eyes following the glowing streams of stars. She spoke softly. "I dream sometimes. I see the mines. I hear the chains. Then I wake, and I think I am still there." Mason sat beside her. "That is normal. Scars remain even when chains are gone. But with time, the dreams will fade." She looked at him, doubt in her eyes. "Do you dream?" "Yes," Mason admitted. "I dream of battles, of lives lost. I carry my own scars too. But what matters is what we do when we wake." Lyra thought about his words for a long time. Slowly, she nodded. "When I wake, I will try to remember the stars." Mason smiled. "That is a good choice." The next day, as they neared the edge of Overseer territory, the ship's alarms blared. Kale shouted from the cockpit, "Patrol ahead. They have spotted us." The freed slaves froze in fear. Panic spread quickly through the cabin. Some cried, some hid their faces, and some trembled as if the chains had returned. Lyra stood frozen, her heart racing. The sound of the alarm dragged her mind back to the mines, to the overseers shouting, to the pain of whips and machines. She struggled to breathe. Mason rushed to calm the slaves. "Listen to me," he said through the translator. "You are free. You will not go back. We will protect you." But the patrol ship was closing fast. Its weapons powered up, and Kale shouted, "We cannot outrun them. We must fight." Joran ran to the weapon systems, his hands flying over controls. "Shields up. Ready to fire." The ship shook as enemy fire struck. Lights flickered, and frightened cries filled the cabin. Rena tried to calm the slaves, but fear had taken hold. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, her body shaking. She whispered, "Not again, not again." Mason saw her fear and rushed to her side. He held her shoulders gently. "Lyra, look at me." Her eyes darted to him, wide and filled with terror. "You are not in the mines," Mason said firmly. "You are here, with us. You are free. And we will fight for you." His words broke through her fear. She gasped for breath, then nodded weakly. The ship shook again as another blast hit. Mason turned to Kale. "Get us into the asteroid field. Use it for cover." Kale steered hard, and the ship dove into the rocks. Enemy fire followed, but the asteroids shielded them. Joran fired back, striking the patrol ship with bursts of energy. Inside the cabin, Lyra watched with wide eyes. For the first time, she saw humans fight not for conquest, but to protect. Each move, each strike, was not for power, but for freedom. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with awe. After a fierce exchange, the human ship outmaneuvered the patrol. Joran fired one last shot, disabling the enemy's engines. The overseer vessel drifted powerless in the void. Cheers filled the cabin. The freed slaves looked at the humans with astonishment. For once, the overseers had been defeated before their eyes. Mason stood tall, breathing heavily, then turned to the slaves. "You see? The overseers are not gods. They can be fought. They can be defeated. Through the translator, his words echoed like fire in their hearts. Many of the freed slaves straightened, their fear replaced by something new, courage. Lyra's eyes shone with tears. She whispered, "You fought, for us." Mason looked at her and said simply, "Always." That night, when silence returned, Lyra sat awake. She thought about the battle, about Mason's words, about the way the humans had risked everything. For the first time in her life, she felt not just hope, but strength. The journey was not over. The colony was still ahead, and danger still hunted them. But within her heart, a new dawn had begun. She was no longer only a victim of the mines. She was someone who could rise beyond the chains of her past. The ship glided toward the edge of the sector, the distant glow of a hidden colony appearing like a small oasis in the vast darkness. The freed slaves pressed against the windows, their eyes wide with wonder. Lyra's gaze was fixed on the colony. She had never seen anything like it, buildings rising gently from the land, lights twinkling like stars, and a soft hum of life that promised safety and peace. Mason stood near the bridge, his hands steady on the railing. He glanced at the freed slaves, then at Lyra, who now sat with a calm she had not felt in years. "We are almost there," he said through the translator. "A place to start anew." Lyra swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She had dreamed of freedom, but this was more than she had imagined. For the first time, she could feel the weight of the mines lifting from her heart. Rena moved among the passengers, preparing them for landing. "Stay calm," she said. "There are people waiting to help you." The freed slaves listened, their trust in the humans growing with every word. Kale carefully guided the ship through the colony's approach. "Clear the landing area," he said over the comms. "We do not want any accidents." The ship touched down gently, its engines humming softly as it settled on the surface. The ramp lowered, and a quiet wind from the colony brushed against the freed slaves. They hesitated for a moment, unsure of what awaited them, but Mason stepped forward. "Come," he said softly, pointing toward the ramp. "Your life begins now." One by one, the slaves stepped onto solid ground, feeling the earth beneath their feet for the first time without chains. Lyra took a deep breath, the air tasting different, cleaner, and full of promise. She looked around at the humans who had saved them. Mason's eyes met hers, and he gave a small smile. A group of colony residents approached. They were diverse, with different shapes, skin tones, and features, yet all their faces held kindness. They carried food, blankets, and simple tools. One of them, an older woman named Sina, spoke gently to the freed slaves. "Welcome," she said. "You are safe here. You will not be forced to work. You will not be controlled. This is your home." Tears filled Lyra's eyes. She stepped closer to Mason, whispering, "Safe, real safe." "Yes," Mason said. "It is real. You are free." The colony workers led the slaves to simple shelters where they could rest, wash, and eat. Lyra felt strange being able to sit without fear, to drink clean water, to breathe freely. She ran her fingers over the soft fabric of her new clothes, marveling at how gentle they were compared to the rough rags of the mines. During the next days, the humans and colony residents helped the freed slaves adapt. They taught them simple tasks, like cooking, cleaning, and caring for each other. Lyra learned quickly, her mind sharp after years of surviving the mines. She discovered small joys she had never known: watching the sun rise, feeling the wind on her face, hearing birds sing in the distance. Mason spent time with Lyra, showing her the colony's library of star maps and books. She asked endless questions about the worlds beyond Draken, about humans, and about how life could be beautiful instead of cruel. He answered patiently, always encouraging her curiosity. One afternoon, Lyra and Mason walked to a small garden in the colony. Green plants grew from the soil, and flowers bloomed brightly. Lyra knelt beside a small plant, touching the soft leaves. "Life grows here," she whispered. Mason nodded. "Yes. Just like you. You survived the mines. You will grow too." For the first time, Lyra smiled freely. She realized she could dream without fear. She could imagine a life filled with choice, friendship, and hope. The other freed slaves began to find their own strength as well. Turin, the older slave, took up gardening. He had never held a tool with care before, only to survive, but now he planted seeds with patience. Others joined him, finding pride and joy in their work. One evening, as the twin sons of the colony said, Lyra stood at the edge of a hill overlooking the village. The sky glowed in soft shades of orange and pink. She breathed deeply, feeling her chest open for the first time in her life. She had known pain, fear, and despair, but now she felt peace. Mason joined her quietly. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have come far," he said softly. "You survived the impossible. And now you can live." Lyra turned to him. "You helped me. All of us. You gave us a life." Mason shook his head gently. "You gave it to yourselves. I only showed the way." Her eyes shone. "I will never forget this. I will never forget you." Mason smiled, a mixture of pride and warmth. "You do not have to. Just live. That is the most important thing." The nights in the colony were peaceful. No alarms, no shouting, no chains. Lyra slept under a clear sky filled with stars. She dreamed of flying through space, of distant worlds filled with light, and of a life filled with choices. Her scars remained, but they no longer defined her. She had survived, and she had hope. Days turned to weeks. The freed slaves learned to live with freedom, to laugh, to talk, and to help one another. Lyra became a quiet leader among them, her strength and calm guiding others who still trembled from years of fear. She taught them words Mason had taught her, and she shared the small joys she had discovered. One morning, as the colony awoke to another bright sunrise, Lyra stood near Mason and looked around. She saw smiles, laughter, and life growing everywhere. Her heart swelled with a feeling she had never known before. I am free," she whispered, softly, to herself. "Yes," Mason said beside her. "And so is everyone here." For Lyra, the new dawn was more than escape from chains. It was a beginning. A beginning filled with hope, friendship, and the promise that no one would ever take her freedom again. She looked at the horizon and knew that whatever the future held, she could face it. Not as a slave, but as someone alive, someone strong, someone free.